Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Okay, here I am trying again. About an hour ago or so, I came out here pretty much unprepared to do another video. Got about 30 minutes into the video, just about ready to wind up. And what happens? My computer shuts down. Well, it doesn't shut down entirely. All of a sudden, I'm about a minute away from finishing, about ready to close out my window, and the video window closes on its own, as does my Windows Media Player, which is where the background music is playing from. And I'm like, that's really weird that would shut itself as well. And all of a sudden, my computer tells me it's doing a Windows update. Well, here's a couple weird things. This is an old computer. This is Windows 7. And Windows no longer does updates for Windows 7. So that's one weird thing. Another thing is, if you have a Windows computer and you're familiar at all with when Windows wants to do updates, it asks you first. It says, Windows wants to do updates. Do you want to install them now? Do you want to put it off for an hour, for a day, for 2 hours, whatever? And then you could choose. This one didn't ask me. It just closed everything down that was going on. So I lost a 30-minute video. And you know, I do these things off the cuff. I could go on about what I was talking about, which is mainly Buddy Rich again. And I could probably remember most of what I said, but to regurgitate it is just, because I do it off the cuff, it's not fun to have to try to recall everything I said. So, I'm just going, if you can see the album in the back, behind me there, right there, that's a Buddy Rich album. One in a series of 4 that I bought in the early 80s, before the CD era. And it's funny, it seems like the only time I get into these heavy Buddy Rich listening periods is when I'm unemployed. The first time was in the early 80s. I was already into jazz for a number of years at that point, but I had seen Buddy Rich on The Tonight Show in the mid-'70s on Johnny Carson's show quite a bit. So I wouldn't say, he might have been the first jazz musician that I could name, because during my high school years when I would see Buddy Rich on The Tonight Show, I was not into anything that wasn't rock music at that point. But Buddy would pop up on The Tonight Show quite a lot, because I rarely watched it. It was not on the weekends, and I wasn't allowed to stay up that late to watch it. So I might only catch it on a Friday night. And yet I still caught a whole bunch of Buddy Rich performances, which I have actually seen repeated since on one of the nostalgia TV channels that I have, that they show the Tonight Show reruns. And I've seen now again within the recent weeks even and months, the same Buddy Rich interviews and performances that I caught on the original airing back in the mid-'70s. So it's kind of like jumping through a time portal or something, because I hadn't seen them since. Not until the Tonight Show reruns started recently, the Johnny Carson Tonight Show reruns. I had not seen these, so pretty much since the mid-'70s, my high school years. And that may be one of the triggers for me revisiting Buddy Rich again. I was listening to him, I don't know, a year or so ago. And some of it's nostalgia, and like probably most people that watch my videos, I'm not necessarily a big band fan. There's always exceptions, and I guess Buddy's band is one of the exceptions. I also like Louie Bellson, who's another drummer band leader from the same period. Though Louie also did big band stuff, but he also did smaller group things, which I navigate more toward because you can hear him more clearly. Now, one of the things I like about Buddy Rich's big band is there's a lot of drum solos. So a lot of people don't like drum solos, and a lot of people that go to specifically rock concerts use the drum solos to go to the bathroom or to get more beer. But that was never me. I always liked the drum solos. I've seen some terrible drum solos. They're out there. But in general, you can say, I guess, the same about guitar solos. But I've always enjoyed the drum solos. And so that's, maybe one of the reasons that I enjoy listening to the big band of Buddy Rich and the musicianship in there. And just, if you play an instrument at all, you can actually pick up a lot of things by listening to these arrangements and the interplay and the harmonies of the horns and all those kind of things. Buddy's bands always had top-notch musicians that were the guys that wrote the music or did the arrangements of the music. In some cases, they would take a song that had been written by somebody else, like the Beatles' Norwegian Wood, and almost totally rewrite it. A big one was, I think it was done by Bill Reddy was the guy's name, but I'm not sure, in the late 60s. There was one of Buddy's musicians who listened to a lot of the music from the West Side Story musical and took various themes from different songs in the musical and kind of fused them together into this West Side Story suite, which was probably the most popular thing to hear at a Buddy Rich concert from the time that it first went on one of his albums. I think it was the late 60s, all the way up until when Buddy died in '87. West Side Story Suite was one of those things that you pretty much heard at every concert, and was something that, although it wasn't written by one of the musicians in Buddy's band, it almost was in a way, because the musician who arranged it kind of went through all the music for West Side Story and picked out themes here and there and fused them together and came up with this completely different arrangement for them that was really, really unique. And I love stuff like that. Buddy's band's always, being a brassy band, always had that that link, I guess, to the early big bands of like the 1940s. You could always hear that, even in the more kind of rocky stuff that was being done in the mid 70s by Buddy's band. And pretty much since the late 60s, the band always had like an electric bass player, so that was one link to more contemporary music at that time. My focal point for listening right now is I do have a couple compilations of early Buddy music from the 50s and early 60s. I tend to go, for whatever reason, maybe it's nostalgia, whatever. I like a lot of the tunes that were in the book of the band during the mid-70s, which was my high school years, which is when I first heard of Buddy. And like I said, he's probably the first jazz musician I knew by name simply because of his Tonight Show appearances. And I had a couple musician friends. I knew people that were drummers, for instance. And they would talk about him, and he was probably, one of the few non-rock musicians whose name that I recall being bandied about in my days before really an awareness or appreciation of jazz. But his 70s bands definitely have a 70s vibe, a 70s sound to them. If you're not familiar with it, but you are familiar with 1970s American television, a lot of TV series and shows, and even to a slightly lesser extent movies, but a lot of TV's shows and series in the 1970s had a soundtrack of music that was done with a lot of brassy horns and things like that. And that was largely because a lot of these musicians that were in the studios that were writing and doing the arrangements and playing on these soundtracks were actually jazz musicians that had maybe gone off the road or decided, at that time jazz was losing its popularity, so instead of trying to start up a band and get a record contract and keep that going, a lot of these guys hit the studios. It was much more lucrative, either as players or writers and arrangers for TV series. And I always hear that whenever I'm listening to my Buddy stuff from the 1970s. I'm always hearing those these little things that remind me of television series, something that could have been a soundtrack to television series. So right now I'm on a Buddy Rich listening kick once again. I'm always learning about since I had to replace my computer, I don't know, about a year and a half to 2 years ago, my main computer in my bedroom, in my main living space, that is where I listen to really just about all my music from. Now, I have a separate stereo, receiver, multiple CD player with bookshelf speakers. Bookshelf speakers aren't that great. I bought a really good pair of speakers for the computer, one that's got a woofer, a bass thing about this big with its own separate volume on it. It's really deep and loud. It's got its own separate volume control in the back, and it's got those two smallish speakers for the high end. But on that thing, the bass is more powerful than my bookshelf speakers, and that's attached to my main computer. So I do all my listening from there. So whenever I buy a CD, a new CD, the first thing I do is I put it in my computer, and that's where I listen to my music from. But because this computer that I have is maybe 2 years old now, and my old computer I had for like 8 or 9 years, that old computer had thousands of albums in. This one has thousands of albums in, but nowhere near what I had. So I'm always amazed at what I don't have yet in my new computer that I thought was in there. I was having a discussion online with somebody, and I mentioned Marilyn Mazer, the percussionist, which made me want to hear her albums. And when I went into my my new computer to look, I'm like, I don't have any of her albums loaded in here, which was really weird because it meant that I have not listened to her music for a year and a half to 2 years at least, which surprised me. So I grabbed the CDs and loaded them in. But it would take me 7 or 8 years to get the number of albums into my newer computer that I had in my old one, because for 8 or 9 years I just constantly loaded music in, and every new CD got loaded in. But I'm always amazed at things that aren't in there that I thought, I thought I had listened to that, and it means that I haven't listened to it for a year and a half, 2 years, maybe longer. Always amazes me. So Marilyn Mazer, the female percussionist, composer, has almost nothing to do with Buddy Rich, but she's going to be my next. I'm going to be listening to her and Buddy Rich. That's going to be, I guess, what's on my plate now. About the only thing they have in common and it's barely in common, is that they're both percussionists. So Marilyn Mazer does not play drum kit. She's a percussionist of all other kinds of percussion, and Buddy Rich was strictly a drum kit player. But I'm going to do some vinyl pulls now, and I'm hoping that. I don't think the computer's going to shut off on me. I did check, and I actually did get a Windows update, which was very strange because Windows doesn't do updates for Windows 7 anymore. And yet, I do see that a Windows update was successfully installed, hence the shutting down of my computer on my last video, which is just very strange because it didn't even ask me if I wanted to install the updates. So I think I'm learning my lesson. I think what happens is, because I only turn on this computer to make videos, what happens is all of these updates, like for my antivirus and things like that, I guess obviously can only be done when the computer's on. So I turn the computer on to make a video, start filming a video, and all of a sudden the system says, oh, the computer's on, let's do an antivirus update, and it slows down my computer, and slows down my videos and things like that. So I guess I have to learn. I have to come out here and turn on the computer an hour or two before I intend on filming, which doesn't really work for me because I do these things much more off the cuff. So I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to do this successfully to avoid problems in the future. And that's if you even get to see this video. So I'm going to do a vinyl pull. I got two, but I'm just going to select one. Well, it's an ECM. What can I say? Jan Garbrick Group, It's Okay to Listen to the Grey Voice, I bought as a new release. $7.99 at Discomat. That's kind of expensive, and that definitely tells me by the price alone, because Discomat was a budget place. It tells me by the price alone. Why didn't I buy this on CD? Well, I guess it came out early '85, so I guess that was just before I also switched over. And on the back here, it says ECM 1294, also available on cassette. So it doesn't even mention CD. So I guess when this initially came out, this would have been early 85. This would have been probably one of the last ECMs that didn't originally, on its original release, also be available on CD. Because by 85, things were pretty much coming out on CD everywhere. But I guess not every album. Because this was recorded December 84, which would have meant, would have been at least another half a year, mid-1985, before it was released. And I would have bought it on CD. 1985 was pretty much the year that I switched over to CDs, unless things weren't available on CDs. So this is one of my better loved albums. Funnily enough, on an earlier, not that long ago, video, and now I don't recall, I think it was, I don't recall, it might have been one that got deleted and I put the record back, but I don't think it was. I did pull out the Jan Garbarek album that preceded this, two prior albums, the Paths and Prince album, which is definitely in my top 5 of Jan Garbarek's album. I know I pulled it out and I spoke about it, but I don't know if that was one of the videos that got deleted or not, and I ended up putting the album back there. I can't recall right now. I think it was one of the videos that made it online, though. And this is the one I like. As far as the Jan Garbarek group albums, this is right behind Paths and Prince for me. It's maybe not quite as up there as Paths and Prince. Both were quartet bands with Jan Garbarek on saxes and flutes on Paths and Prince, though he doesn't play flutes on this one. Eberhard Weber on bass on both albums, and a guitarist and drummer, though they're different. The original guitarist on Paths and Prince was Bill Frisell, who did a wonderful job. David Torn is his replacement on this album, and the only album he recorded with the Jan Garbarek group. And he plays a guitar synthesizer and a DX7 keyboard. And Mike DePasqua replaces John Christensen, who was the drummer on Paths and Prince. The late, great Mike DePasqua, who I got to see play live once. And this is my second favorite Jan Garbarek group album. And I will say, in terms of the playing, I really like the writing on this. I like the playing. And David Torn, for me, this is the best playing I've ever heard him, as far as I'm concerned. I have bought quite a lot of David Torn solo albums and group project albums where he was a co-leader with other people, like the Blue Group with Tony Levin and Bill Bruford, and various projects he's done on his own and with other musicians over the years. And I got to tell you, in general, I've given David Torn a lot of chances, but to me his music is just too noisy. And that's not to say I wouldn't even buy, because I would still buy something. Actually, I haven't picked it up yet. But his ECM album that he did a couple years ago, which was just him solo, is probably the next best thing I've ever heard him do. He needs to be reined down a little bit. To me, his stuff is just too noisy at times. And I bought a ton of, I got quite a lot of his albums, even one he did for Windham Hill, couple he did for ECM, which were good but not great. But there's something about him playing on here that he dialed it down a notch, and for me it's his best playing because he's a little more subdued. Now, I don't think Jan Garbarek is the kind of guy to boss people around and tell them what to play, even though this is Jan Garbarek's group. So my thought was that David Torn probably listened to the two prior Jan Garbarek group albums, which had Bill Frisell on them, which were, Bill Frisell's quite a lot more laid back than Torn was. He didn't quite get into the noisy end of things, a bit more spacious and atmospheric than out and out fuzz boxy noisy stuff. And I always wondered if maybe Dave Torn listened to those albums and figured that he should kind of keep that role very similar in the Jan Garbarek group, maybe because it worked, or maybe he thought that's what Jan Garbarek wanted. I don't know. But it worked. It was definitely David Torn's most subdued playing. And to me, it was the most effective too. He's the guy that sets the stage, playing, being essentially the lead instrument when the saxophone isn't playing the main melody or soloing. It's David Torn's guitar and keyboards that are filling up that in-between sonic area, between the saxophone and between the rhythm section of bass and drums. So it's his guitars and his keyboards. He does a great job on this. So even though this was not the first place I heard him, he also recorded 2 albums with the Everyman Band, which were on ECM, which I was really not crazy about. I was surprised to ever hear ECM sign that kind of music. Also very noisy stuff. And so I was quite surprised to hear David Torn being this laid back, reserved. I don't know. It works. To me, it works. It's one of the... I think this would make it in the top 5 or 6 Jan Garbarek albums overall. That's not a small thing considering the number of albums that Jan Garbarek's made. I do recommend this one. I still like Paz and Prince a lot better, though. And I'd recommend people get that one before, but still, this is pretty damn good. I just pulled out the other album that was sticking out that was next to it that I almost picked out. And here's one that I still want to get on CD, but the CD goes in and out of print. And when I've seen it, it was fairly expensive. And for years it was unavailable. So here is not an ECM recording. It is an album recorded in June 1970. You have to think of that. 1970. That is a Joe Pass album. Now, I knew Joe Pass is a mainstream jazz guitarist. Excellent. Technically one of those guitarists. I don't listen much to him because he's so brilliant technically. When I hear him, it makes me not want to play. He's too good. Or he was too good. His solo albums, just solo guitar, holy crap. How could somebody could play it? It's like Segovia. But one of the things, now I already was familiar with Joe Pass, but one of the things that made me pick up this specific album when I saw it in the store was because Eberhard Weber is the bass player, so there's an ECM connection here. It's just a guitar, bass, drums trio, Kenny Clare on drums, and this was done in, I believe this was recorded in one day. It doesn't state that, but I saw an interview with Eberhard Weber where he spoke about this album. And I think he mentioned, there's some liner notes here, I don't know if I was going to mention it there, but I did see Eberhard Weber mention that, pretty sure that this was recorded in one day, really without a whole lot of preparation. Mostly covers. Joe Pass didn't write a lot. He does write one tune here called Joe's Blues. Everything else are songs that were current then, Michel Legrand, Bobby Gentry's Ode to Billy Joel, which was a pop song, and things that are closer to jazz standards. But this was really interesting to me. Now, at the time I picked this up, I want to probably the early 80s. I want to say that I was definitely already an Eberhard Weber fan. I wanted to hear him in this context of this mainstream setting. It's not what he's known to play. I'm pretty sure he plays an upright bass on this, not the upright electric that he's known for. But, it's been years since I heard this, and I do want to get this on CD. But I think he's playing a standard upright bass on this. And it's interesting to hear and to know it's Eberhard Weber because he's doing the walking bass lines. Not the kind of thing that Eberhard Weber was known to do. Even in the United Rock and Jazz Ensemble, the big band that he was a part of, I don't recall him really doing a lot of like walking type bass lines. That was more of a modern kind of band. And that band played mostly their own compositions. They weren't doing jazz standards or mainstream jazz. But this was an excellent album, of mainstream jazz guitar trio, all the same regardless of who's playing on it. But to me, it's just made that much more interesting by the fact that it's Eberhard Weber on bass, with in this very mainstream kind of walking bass style. I would never have picked that was him playing if I didn't know. And he did speak about the album in an interview that I saw with him, very briefly, but so it definitely is him playing. I don't think it was planned. I seem to remember the session was thrown together because they had, I think Joe Pass was recording on an album of someone else's or another album of his own in the studio when they had extra time left over. The album was finished recording and they had extra studio time left over. And I think they threw this together at the last minute, which is just incredible when you hear it because it sounds like it's very arranged and very worked out. 10 songs, most of them anywhere from 3.5 minutes to 6 minutes. So there's not any real long jams, but an interesting album. Of course, now that I pulled it, I really do want to hear it again. I'm gonna pull one more. Pull another album. Oh, I forgot about this one. Peter and Michael Hamill, who a lot of you know as a keyboard player. How did I get into him? Well, I don't know. I probably would have picked up or discovered some of his albums anyway, though at this time, I don't think that I was seeing his albums in the store. I think I was, for the most part, buying his albums through the old-fashioned mail-order catalog. This is before the CD era, before the internet era. And this one, I probably would have bought fairly close to the time that it came out. It was recorded in December 1979, released in 1980 on the Kuckuck label, the German label. I'm pretty sure I bought this mail order. And this album is just Peter Michael Hamill solo by himself on synthesizer and electric organ. You know what? I think Ulrich Krauss also plays keyboards on this as well, unless I'm mistaken. Ulrich Krauss is credited with being the engineer, but I believe he's also playing some keyboards as well. So I don't know if that means these were recorded live, because I noticed on a lot of Peter Michael Hamill albums there are 2 keyboard players credited on there, and I can't figure out why Peter Michael Hamill would need another keyboard player, with the possible exception of the fact that maybe a lot of his albums in the 70s or so and going into the early 80s may have been recorded live, and his concept was for more keyboards than he could play live, so he invited other keyboard players to be a second keyboard player. I don't know what his thinking behind that was, or why he wouldn't just overdub the parts himself. Haven't heard this in ages. I'm not sure. I've got a couple Peter Michael Hamill CDs, 2 or 3. I don't know if this is one of them. I think I might have an excerpt of one of the pieces on one of the CDs, which is a compilation CD. I don't think I have this full album on CD, so I haven't heard it for ages. It's just 2 parts. Colors. The first side is Colors of Time Part 1, 22 minutes. Side 2 is Colors of Time Part 2, 18 minutes. So it's a 40-minute album, and all keyboards, and I recall liking it. And here's that. I like the Kuckuck label at the time, the color, the bird in the bush. Kind of similar to the German. The Germans had this thing with birds, I guess. These German jazz labels or creative music labels, because remember the Nightingale record label that I was showing the Kamal CD, the Kamal albums. Another keyboard player. Nightingale has this very cute black and white record logo of a bird sitting on a bush, a nightingale, in the night sky, and you see the little stars. I like that imagery on the label like that. Okay, so I did a half hour. Hopefully this one is going to come out, and it hasn't shut itself off on me yet. Don't know if it's slowed down, because I saw once again that maintenance things are being run here again. It's a problem I have, because I don't turn the computer on, I guess, and just leave it be for enough hours. So whenever I do turn it on to film a video, it wants to do maintenance tasks. When it does maintenance tasks, it slows down the processors of the computer, which screws up my videos. So they're really all hit and miss. But I did 3 picks, and I regurgitated some of what I spoke about on my deleted half-hour video from a couple hours ago. And I'm going to go for now. Hope everyone's doing well, and hope I didn't waste your time with this video. Okay, guys, I'll be back soon. Take it easy.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.